Hi, Leo. Wow. I have to be honest, the energy coming through already feels incredibly strong. I pulled your cards, sat with them for a moment, and something immediately stood out to me. There's a feeling here that someone can no longer look away from what they feel for you. The more they try to keep things quiet, the louder these emotions seem to become. And what really caught my attention is that this doesn't feel one-sided. It feels like two people quietly carrying the same thoughts, the same curiosity, and maybe even the same unanswered feelings. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just listen to what wants to come through. Because something about this story feels much bigger than words left unsaid. Let's see where the cards want to take us. Honestly, as I sit with this energy a little longer, I keep getting this feeling someone is reaching a point where they can no longer explain you away. For a long time, I think they tried. They tried telling themselves you were just someone they met, just someone they cared about, just someone who happened to leave an impression. But that explanation doesn't seem to work anymore. Because every time they think they've put this connection into a neat little box, something happens that pulls it right back into their awareness. And that's what immediately stands out to me about judgment. Not because of what the card means, but because of the feeling that comes with it. It feels like someone waking up to something they can no longer ignore. You know, I keep seeing this person going through ordinary moments. Driving somewhere, sitting at work, lying awake a little longer than usual. And somehow your name, your face, your energy keeps finding its way into those quiet spaces, not because they're forcing it. Actually, I think that's what's surprising them the most. The thoughts seem to arrive on their own, and the more they arrive, the harder it becomes to dismiss them. Because here's the thing, this person doesn't look at you the same way anymore. I don't think they even realize when that shift happened. At first, maybe you were simply someone they enjoyed talking to, someone they admired, someone who made life feel a little brighter. But somewhere along the way, that became something much deeper, and now they're beginning to recognize it. The sun is sitting here, and wow, there is something incredibly warm about the way they think about you. It's almost like whenever your energy enters their mind, everything softens for a moment. The stress, the pressure, the noise, all of it seems to fade into the background. And what they're starting to understand is that this doesn't happen with everyone. It doesn't happen often. I think they're realizing that your presence has become part of their emotional landscape. Whether you're physically around or not, whether you're speaking every day or not, there's something about you that stays with them. And honestly, that realization feels a little overwhelming, because once they acknowledge how important you actually are, they also have to acknowledge how much space you occupy in their heart. The Six of Cups keeps drawing my attention back to memories, small memories, simple memories, moments that probably seemed insignificant at the time, a conversation, a smile, a look. Something you said without even realizing the impact it would have. And now those memories keep resurfacing, almost as if their mind is revisiting them from a completely different perspective. I mean, have you ever looked back at a moment and suddenly realized it mattered more than you thought? That's exactly what this feels like. This person is beginning to re-examine pieces of the past and seeing them through new eyes. And every memory seems to carry the same question. Why did this person affect me so deeply? Why are they still here in my thoughts? Why do I still feel connected to them? Because the more they try to answer those questions, the more they realize this connection has never been as simple as they once believed. The star feels very quiet here, very gentle, not dramatic, not chaotic, just honest. It's the feeling of someone sitting alone with their thoughts and finally allowing themselves to admit something. Maybe not out loud, maybe not to anyone else, but at least to themselves that you matter a lot, more than they expected, more than they planned for, more than they ever intended. And that's where this awakening seems to be happening, slowly, naturally, without force, without pressure, just one realization at a time. Because every attempt to push these feelings aside seems to bring them right back. Every effort to stay detached somehow reminds them of your importance. And I think that's why this energy feels so significant. They're no longer questioning whether you've impacted their life. They're beginning to understand just how much. And for someone who spent a long time trying to keep those emotions neatly organized, that realization changes everything inside of them. Okay, let's keep going because I can already feel this story getting deeper. Something shifts when a person realizes they could actually lose something they never thought would matter this much. And honestly, that's where I feel this energy moving. Because the moment someone understands your value, another feeling tends to show up right behind it, fear. Not the loud kind, not panic. More like a quiet discomfort sitting in the background of their thoughts. The kind that appears when they're alone. The kind that asks questions they don't really want to answer. Because I'm looking at the Nine of Swords, and what I'm seeing isn't someone sleeping peacefully. I see someone replaying conversations, replaying decisions, replaying moments where they could have done things differently. And, the strange thing is that these thoughts aren't coming from anger. They're coming from awareness. They're starting to recognize that life keeps moving. People keep growing. People keep changing. And somewhere inside, they're realizing that you're not standing still waiting for them to figure everything out. That realization feels important. Because for a long time, I think part of them assumed there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another chance, another moment. But lately, I don't think they're feeling so certain about that. I keep seeing them watching from a distance, not necessarily physically, more emotionally, trying to understand where they stand in your world now, trying to understand if the version of you they once knew is still there. And honestly, that uncertainty is creating a lot of emotion. The Five of Cups feels very present here, because underneath all of this, I keep sensing regret. Not dramatic regret, not the kind people talk about openly, the quiet kind, the private kind, the kind a person carries without telling anyone. I feel like there are moments where they suddenly remember something they should have said, something they should have acknowledged, a moment where they could have shown up differently, and for a second it hits them. Maybe harder than they expected, because they're beginning to understand that connections don't stay exactly the same forever. People evolve, circumstances change, and what once felt guaranteed can start feeling fragile. Wow, this energy feels incredibly human, because I don't see a villain here. I don't see someone trying to hurt you. I see someone struggling with themselves, someone who spent a long time protecting parts of their heart, someone who became so used to self-protection that they forgot how vulnerable connection can actually feel. The Hanged Man keeps pulling my attention toward a pause, a space between knowing and acting, and that's exactly where this person seems to be. They know something has changed inside of them. They know their feelings are becoming harder to ignore, yet there is still hesitation, still caution, still old fears whispering in the background. What if they get hurt? What if they're misunderstood? What if they open up and things don't unfold the way they imagined? Sometimes the biggest battle isn't between two people. Sometimes it's between the version of ourselves that wants love and the version of ourselves that's terrified of it. And that's what I keep seeing here. Their heart seems ready to move closer. Their fears keep asking them to stay where it's safe. Their heart says one thing, their ego says another. Their heart remembers connection. Their ego remembers disappointment. Their heart wants honesty. Their ego wants protection. And neither side seems willing to back down completely. Which brings me to death. And honestly, this card feels much softer than people expect. Because what I'm seeing isn't destruction. What I'm seeing is exhaustion. The exhaustion that comes from carrying the same fears for too long. The exhaustion that comes from repeating the same emotional patterns over and over again. I feel like this person is becoming tired of being ruled by old wounds. Tired of letting past experiences make decisions for their present life. Tired of convincing themselves they don't care when they clearly do. And something about that realization feels significant, because once a person starts seeing their own patterns clearly, it's difficult to go back to pretending they don't exist. I think they're beginning to notice the walls they've built, the distance they've created, the moments where fear made choices that their heart never actually wanted. And for perhaps the first time in a long time, they're looking at those patterns honestly, not with judgment, not with shame, just honesty. Okay, and I have to say this. The deeper I move into this energy, the less this feels like a story about losing someone. And the more it feels like a story about someone confronting the parts of themselves that have kept them disconnected from what they truly want. Because that's where the real struggle seems to be happening. Not outside of them, inside of them. And that internal battle is becoming impossible to ignore. There's something almost fascinating about what happens after a person stops running from their feelings, because once they acknowledge them, even privately, their attention naturally starts moving toward the source. And honestly, that's exactly what I feel happening here. The Page of Swords keeps showing me someone who's paying much closer attention than they let on. Not in an unhealthy way, not in an obsessive way, more like someone who has become deeply curious. Curious about you, curious about your life, curious about who you're becoming. Because the version of you they see now doesn't feel exactly the same as the person they first met. Something has shifted, something has grown, and they notice it. I keep seeing them observing from the edges of the story, watching your progress, watching your confidence, watching the way you carry yourself. And what surprises them is how naturally you've stepped into your own energy. There are moments when people expect growth to look dramatic, but that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is much quieter. The way you respond differently, the way you seem more comfortable in your own skin, the way you're no longer looking for permission to be yourself. And somehow, every time they witness that version of you, it leaves an impression. The Queen of Wands feels incredibly present here, because the energy surrounding you feels magnetic. Not because you're trying to attract attention, not because you're performing, not because you're proving anything. It's almost the opposite. I feel like the less you try to convince anyone of your worth, the more obvious it becomes. And this person notices that. Wow, they really notice that. Because I keep hearing this unspoken thought inside their mind. When did they become this confident? When did they become this strong? When did they stop doubting themselves? And the truth is, part of them feels inspired by it. Part of them feels proud of it. But if I'm being honest, part of them also feels emotional about it. Because every step forward you take seems to remind them how important your connection has been in their own life. The sun appears again, and the feeling around it is beautiful. Not loud, not dramatic, just warm. I keep seeing them smile when they think about you. Not all the time, not every day, but enough that they notice it. Enough that they catch themselves. Enough that they realize your energy still affects them. And I think that's one of the reasons they keep paying attention. Because in a world where so many things feel temporary, your presence feels strangely consistent. Even when life changes, even when circumstances change, even when distance exists, there is still something about you that feels familiar to them. Comforting, alive, real. Honestly, I think they're beginning to understand that attraction was never the whole story here. Because if this were only attraction, those feelings would have faded by now. What I'm seeing feels deeper than that. The Ace of Cups is sitting here, and the energy around it feels incredibly genuine, like emotions that keep growing in quiet spaces, emotions that weren't planned, emotions that weren't expected. I don't feel someone forcing themselves to feel this way. I feel someone gradually realizing that their heart has been moving in this direction for a long time. And what's interesting is that the more they observe you, the more they seem to understand themselves. Almost like you're reflecting something back to them, not intentionally, not directly, but simply by being who you are. I mean, sometimes another person's growth challenges us to look at our own life. Sometimes seeing someone thrive forces us to ask difficult questions. Am I happy? Am I being honest with myself? Am I becoming the person I want to be? And that's exactly what I feel happening here. This person isn't just watching you. They're measuring themselves against the truth they see in you. They're looking at your courage and asking where they've been holding themselves back. They're looking at your confidence and wondering what fears they're still carrying. They're looking at your authenticity and realizing how much energy they've spent hiding parts of themselves. And the more they look, the harder it becomes to look away. Because every observation seems to create another feeling, another realization, another layer of appreciation. Okay, and I have to say this before we move deeper into the story. What stands out most isn't that they're watching your journey. It's why they're watching. Because underneath all of this curiosity, admiration, and attention, there seems to be a growing awareness that your presence has become meaningful in ways they never fully expected. And that awareness is continuing to pull them closer to the truth of what they feel. What makes this energy so interesting is that the closer they get to the truth, the harder it becomes to keep living the same way they always have. Because once you start seeing things clearly, certain parts of your life begin to feel different. Certain people feel different. Certain habits feel different. Certain choices don't fit the way they used to. And that's exactly where I feel this person standing right now. The Eight of Cups feels incredibly present, not because I see someone running away. Actually, it's the opposite. I see someone slowly turning toward themselves, toward honesty, toward questions they've avoided for a long time. Because there seems to be a growing awareness that some things in their life no longer reflect who they're becoming. And honestly, that realization can be uncomfortable. I keep seeing them looking around their world differently, looking at relationships differently, looking at routines differently, looking at situations they've tolerated for years and suddenly asking themselves, why am I still carrying this? Why am I still giving energy to something that no longer feels right? Why am I staying connected to things that leave me feeling empty? Those questions seem to be appearing more frequently now, and I don't think it's happening by accident. Because the more they think about you, the more they start thinking about the life they actually want. Not the life they've settled into, not the life they've learned to manage, the life they genuinely want. And wow, that's a powerful thing for a person to confront. Strength keeps catching my attention here, because I don't see courage showing up in some dramatic way. I see quiet courage, the kind that happens behind closed doors, the kind nobody applauds, the kind that asks a person to be completely honest with themselves. I feel like this person is beginning to understand that becoming a better version of themselves isn't about impressing anyone. It's about alignment. It's about waking up each day and knowing they're living in a way that feels true. And the more they move toward that realization, the more they recognize how much fear has influenced certain decisions, how much self-doubt has influenced certain decisions, how much comfort has influenced certain decisions. You know, sometimes people don't stay in situations because they're happy. Sometimes they stay because they're familiar. And familiarity can be incredibly difficult to walk away from, especially when you've built your identity around it, especially when other people expect you to remain the same, especially when change feels uncertain. Which brings me to the tower, and honestly, this energy feels less like chaos and more like truth arriving. The kind of truth that shakes loose everything that was built on assumptions, everything that was built on avoidance, everything that was built on pretending certain feelings didn't exist. I keep seeing moments where this person suddenly understands something about themselves, almost like pieces clicking into place. A conversation affects them differently, an experience affects them differently, a memory affects them differently, and once that understanding arrives, they can't really go back to seeing things the old way, because the old way no longer feels convincing. The old explanations no longer feel complete. The old excuses no longer feel comfortable. There is a growing awareness that some chapter of their life is changing internally, not because anyone is forcing it, not because anyone is demanding it, because they're beginning to recognize it themselves. Honestly, that kind of change is usually the most powerful. The Knight of Pentacles feels important here because everything I'm seeing happens gradually, very gradually. This doesn't feel rushed. This doesn't feel impulsive. I don't see somebody making reckless decisions. I see somebody thinking, reflecting, observing, evaluating, trying to understand what comes next. And I think that's because they genuinely want their next steps to reflect the person they're becoming rather than the person they've been. There seems to be a desire to build something stronger within themselves first, to become more grounded, more honest, more mature, more accountable. And one thing I keep noticing is that they're starting to take responsibility for things they previously avoided looking at. Not because someone told them to, because they want to understand themselves better. They want to understand why certain fears have controlled them, why certain patterns keep repeating, why certain opportunities slipped away. And somewhere in that process, they're beginning to see how much their life has been shaped by choices made from fear rather than truth. Okay, and this is where the energy starts becoming really interesting. Because what I'm seeing isn't simply someone changing their circumstances. I'm seeing someone changing their relationship with themselves. And once that begins to happen, the entire direction of a person's life can start shifting in ways they never expected. Something about this energy feels like a person standing at the edge of a conversation they've been rehearsing in their head for a very long time. Not because they suddenly found all the answers. Not because every fear disappeared, but because keeping everything inside is starting to feel heavier than speaking the truth. And honestly, that's the feeling I get the moment I look at the Eight of Wands. It's like thoughts that were moving slowly suddenly begin finding momentum. Words that stayed trapped inside begin searching for a way out. Feelings that were hidden behind silence start pushing closer to the surface. I keep seeing this person having imaginary conversations with you. You know, the kind people have when they're driving alone. The kind they have while staring out a window. The kind they have before falling asleep. They picture what they would say, how they would explain themselves, how they would describe everything they've been feeling. And every time they imagine that conversation, it becomes a little more real, a little less frightening, a little more necessary. Because the truth is, there are things they've wanted to tell you for quite some time. Things they haven't fully known how to express. Things they've struggled to put into words. Not because the feelings aren't there. Because the feelings run deeper than the words themselves. The Ace of Swords feels incredibly clear here, and wow, there is something powerful about clarity arriving after a long period of confusion. I feel like this person is starting to recognize that honesty isn't only about speaking. It's also about admitting things to yourself. Admitting what you feel, admitting what matters, admitting what you've been avoiding. And once those admissions begin happening internally, the desire to communicate becomes much stronger. Because silence no longer feels comfortable. Avoidance no longer feels comfortable. Pretending no longer feels comfortable. I keep hearing this energy say, I need to be honest. Not necessarily with everyone. Not necessarily all at once. But honest. because there's a growing awareness that certain truths deserve space to exist. And one of those truths seems connected to you. Honestly, I don't think this person can look at this connection the way they once did. Too much has changed. Too much has been realized. Too much has been felt. The Two of Wands feels like someone standing between two versions of their future, not knowing every detail, not knowing exactly how everything unfolds, but understanding that a choice is forming, a real choice. And I think that's why this energy feels so reflective. They're looking ahead more than they used to, looking beyond immediate comfort, looking beyond old habits, looking beyond familiar patterns. They're asking bigger questions now, questions about where they're headed, questions about who they want to become, questions about what they genuinely want their life to feel like. And somewhere inside those questions, your presence keeps appearing, not as an interruption, not as a distraction, but as part of the picture they're trying to understand, part of the future they're trying to imagine, part of the truth they're trying to accept. Because the more they look forward, the harder it becomes to separate those thoughts from thoughts of you. And that realization feels important, very important. The Emperor feels different in this reading than people might expect. Because what I see isn't someone trying to control everything. I see someone trying to take responsibility, someone trying to become more intentional, more mature, more accountable for their own choices. I keep getting the feeling that this person is tired of letting fear make decisions for them, tired of letting uncertainty decide their next step, tired of feeling disconnected from their own truth. And while they may not have everything figured out yet, I do see them wanting to approach things differently, wanting to show up differently, wanting to handle this chapter of their life with greater honesty than they have in the past. You know, growth sometimes looks very quiet from the outside. Nobody sees the internal conversations. Nobody sees the moments of reflection. Nobody sees the private decisions being made. But those moments matter, because that's where change begins. And that's exactly what I feel happening here. A shift in perspective, a shift in priorities, a shift in how they see themselves, a shift in how they see this connection.
Okay.
And what fascinates me most is that this energy doesn't feel rushed. It feels intentional. Like someone slowly gathering the courage to step closer to something they've been thinking about for much longer than anyone realizes. And the closer they move toward that truth, the less distance seems to exist between what they feel and what they're finally ready to acknowledge. What feels different here is that the energy is no longer circling around questions. It's beginning to circle around possibilities. And honestly, that's a very different place to be. Because curiosity can keep a person at a distance. Attraction can keep a person at a distance. Even feelings can remain hidden for a very long time. But once someone starts imagining a future, something shifts. The conversation inside their heart changes. The questions become deeper. The reflections become more meaningful. And that's exactly what I feel as the Ten of Cups appears. There is a softness here that wasn't present before. A warmth. A sense of emotional comfort. Almost like this person has stopped looking at this connection as a temporary feeling and started looking at it as something that could actually have substance, something that could exist in real life, something that could grow. I keep seeing them imagining ordinary moments, and that's what stands out to me. Not fantasy, not perfection, ordinary moments, sharing stories at the end of a long day, laughing over something small, being understood without having to explain every detail, feeling at home in someone's presence. You know, sometimes those simple images reveal more than grand romantic gestures ever could. Because when people start picturing everyday happiness with someone, it usually means they're seeing that person differently. And that's what I feel here. A shift from emotion to vision, a shift from attraction to possibility, a shift from wondering to imagining. The Empress feels incredibly beautiful in this part of the story, not because of anything dramatic, but because there is a growing appreciation for what makes a connection feel safe, what makes it feel nourishing, what makes it feel worth protecting. I keep hearing this energy say, I don't want to force anything. I don't want to control everything. I want something that grows naturally. And honestly, that feels important. Because I think this person is beginning to understand that real connection isn't built through pressure. It isn't built through fear. It isn't built through trying to hold on too tightly. It's built through trust, through presence, through showing up consistently, through creating space for both people to remain themselves while still building something together. And wow, that's a much more mature energy than what I was seeing earlier in this reading. The Wheel of Fortune keeps turning quietly in the background. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. And it feels like perspective is continuing to evolve. I see this person looking back at their life and realizing how much has changed already. The way they think has changed. The way they view relationships has changed. The way they view you has changed. Even the fears that once seemed so powerful don't appear quite the same anymore. And I think that's because growth has been happening little by little, day by day, realization by realization, without them even fully noticing it at first. Honestly, some of the biggest transformations happen that way, not through one massive moment, but through 1,000 small moments that slowly reshape the way we see ourselves and the world around us. The Four of Wands feels incredibly grounding, because what I see isn't someone chasing excitement anymore. I see someone valuing stability, valuing peace, valuing emotional security, valuing partnership. There is something very comforting about this energy. Like someone beginning to understand that happiness doesn't have to be complicated. That connection doesn't always have to feel like a struggle. That two people can move toward the same vision without losing themselves in the process. And that's what keeps standing out to me. This doesn't feel like two people trying to control one another. It feels like two people learning how to walk beside one another, learning how to support rather than direct, learning how to understand rather than assume, learning how to build rather than simply hope. I mean, that's not always an easy lesson, especially for people who have spent years protecting themselves, especially for people who have been disappointed before, especially for people who learn to rely only on themselves. Yet that's exactly what seems to be unfolding here. A growing willingness to imagine something shared. A growing willingness to believe that connection can coexist with independence. That love can coexist with personal growth. That partnership can coexist with authenticity. Okay, and as I sit with the final energy of this story, what stays with me most isn't urgency. It isn't pressure. It isn't certainty. It's readiness. Not perfect readiness. Not complete readiness. Just the quiet sense that two people may be approaching life from a much more honest place than they once were. And sometimes, that inner shift becomes the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave this reading. And honestly, I feel like this story still has a few chapters left to reveal in its own time. For now, just remember that growth often happens quietly. Understanding happens quietly, and sometimes the most meaningful changes begin long before anyone says a word. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I never take your time, your energy, or your trust for granted. If this reading resonated with you, take what feels true for your journey and simply leave the rest. Be gentle with yourself. Keep moving forward, one step at a time. And I'll be here when you're ready for the next reading. Until then, take care, stay safe, and keep shining your light, Leo. Bye, everyone.